It was still nighttime at Sweet Apple Acres. Applejack wasn't able to sleep, still grieving over her lost friend. She probably wouldn't be able to sleep for a few weeks. After brushing her mane and the tears off her face, she walked out of her cottage, slowly making her way across the fields toward the barn. She took her time, slowly walking through the long grass, letting the long strands gently stroke her fur. At least, she could feel something. By the time Applejack had made it to the barn, the sun had rose to light the colorful fields around her. However, the beautiful sunrise did nothing to lighten up Applejack's world, which was still covered in a dark and gray hue. Right now, all she wanted was to see Pinkie Pie bouncing towards her, greeting her with a cheerful smile, like she always did. Applejack shed a tear before walking into the wooden barn. She slowly walked up to the apple wagon, pulling the heavy contraption to the left. Just then, there was a click. It was barely audible, but the sound echoed through the empty barn. Applejack's head darted towards the source of the sound, to see that the barn door had been closed. She turned to face the large door and started to walk slowly towards it. Who was it? She thought. Could it be? No. She shook her head, thinking she was overreacting. Hello? Hello? Who's the... Suddenly, she was cut off by a flutter of Pegasus wings coming from the roof. Geez, okay, joke's over. Come on now, this isn't funny. Just then, she heard a giggle. The sinister-sounding laugh sent shivers down Applejack's spine. But she stayed composed, despite the overwhelming fear that had started to take over her body. Her mind kept trying to promote the possibility that it could be the cold-blooded killer coming back to finish the job. Is that you, Apple Bloom? Scootaloo? Her voice sounded trembly. She couldn't put a brave face on anymore. Applejack then heard a sound of metallic bang coming from within the shadows. The sudden boom startled the earth pony. She lost her footing and tripped, landing on the ground, knocking the wind out of her. As she gasped for air, she looked up, and then she saw a dark, shadowed figure, one rose eye glowing through the darkness, staring at her. Applejack froze, holding her breath. Who are you? Applejack whimpered. It didn't respond. It kept laughing, giggling at her. Applejack was terrified, but she frowned and jumped to her feet, stomping her hoof. Who the hell are you? Tell me! The laughing ceased. The dark figure started to walk towards her. Applejack backed against the wall, fear showing strong in her eyes. The shadowed figure then walked past the window, the light shining through and revealing her true identity. Applejack could only gasp as she realized who the mysterious figure was. It was Rainbow Dash. Her mane was ruined, her body was covered, head to hoof, in cuts and bruises, and her eyes were completely bloodshot. Rainbow? Oh, my Celestia, what happened to you? Rainbow? Rainbow snarled, the menacing growl making Applejack's heart skip a beat. Applejack began to back up against the wall again, her legs trembling with fear. Are you okay? Rainbow Dash didn't answer. She just giggled as she made her way towards the terrified earth pony. She pulled out a long blade, which was hidden beneath her wing. It was bloody and twisted, but it still gleamed with a menacing sharp edge. Applejack instantly panicked and sprinted for the door. As she reached the handle, Rainbow Dash threw the knife, jamming the lock of the barn door and barely missing Applejack's muzzle. Applejack froze, as she couldn't help but stare at the long, gory knife in front of her. Applejack turned only to see the Pegasus pony had disappeared. Tense moments passed. Adrenaline was surging through her veins. Applejack heard a whisper coming from the roof and looked up to see the blue Pegasus flying towards her. Applejack had no time to react as she was tackled to the ground by the cyan blur. The Pegasus knelt on both Applejack's shoulders, holding her down. Applejack tried to buck the grinning Pegasus off her chest, but Rainbow Dash grabbed the petrified pony by the neck. Applejack choked, gurgled, and flailed her arms and legs wildly, as the Pegasus pony began to sing with a gentle yet content voice, grasping her neck tighter and tighter. Hush now, quiet. Now it's time to lay your sleepy head. Hush now, quiet. Now it's time to go to bed. Applejack was growing faint. She stared at the crazed pony's bloodshot eyes, beating desperately on her arms to try to loosen the deadly grip. But, no matter what she did, the grip just got stronger. Just then, Applejack noticed a large wooden splinter from the corner of her eye, just in reach of her right hoof. Her face turning purple, Applejack grabbed the piece of timber and winced at the thought of what she was about to do to her friend. Applejack had no choice. She closed her eyes before forcing the splinter into Rainbow Dash's left leg. Rainbow Dash screamed in pain before Applejack bucked her off with her shoulders. Applejack gasped for air, desperately trying to get back on her hooves. She turned to see Rainbow wincing in pain, a large pool of blood forming around her as she slowly pulled a large splinter out of her leg. Rainbow Dash laughed, despite the intense pain now forming in her leg, and gave Applejack a look that made her sick to her stomach. "What on earth has happened to you, Rainbow? What's wrong with you?" Applejack yelled, rubbing the sore rash on her neck. "Giggle at the ghostlies." Rainbow Dash then stood up, staring at Applejack, crouching down, ready to pounce. "Don't even think about it," Applejack growled, but the insane pony remained unfazed. Rainbow Dash snarled again before sprinting towards her prey. Applejack was trapped, and only with one option left. With nowhere else to go, Applejack charged towards the crazed pony, sweat dripping from her forehead. As Rainbow jumped, Applejack dropped to slide on her stomach, using her back legs to buck the crazed mare into the cellar behind her. Silence finally struck the barn, giving Applejack the opportunity to catch her breath. Applejack was petrified. She couldn't leave the barn. Her main exit was blocked by the broken lock on the door, caused by the sharp throw of the knife jamming it shut. Her second exit was through the dark, cold cellar, but there was no doubt that the crazed Pegasus was still down there, waiting for her to make her move. Her house was half a mile away, but that didn't stop her from screaming. She screamed as much as she possibly could, screamed for the death of her friend, screamed for the corruption of another, screaming that Big Macintosh, some pony, would hear her. How could she do that? How could she kill Pinkie Pie? Why should she want to kill her? Why should she want to kill me? All sorts of thoughts whirled around her mind, shrouded in a cloud of confusion, but she knew there was only one way to save herself. Big Macintosh could be awake, but he never goes near the barn once apple bucking season starts. He'd be too busy working. There's a chance he'd check on the barn if he thought Applejack was missing, but she didn't know if Big Macintosh would find her dead or alive by then. It was useless. She couldn't keep hoping for the best. Now was the time to act if she was to survive. She grabbed a pitchfork, which was propped up against the wall, unsure if she could will herself to use it against her friend. She took a deep breath before she poked her head into the dark cellar. She couldn't see anything. The dark walls seemed to dance in the shadows, closing in on her. This made her feel even more worried that she was being led into a trap. But just in the distance she saw a light coming from the cellar door. She turned to the light and turned it on, to see a long trail of blood on the floor. The trail seemed to head towards the door, before it disappeared into the darkness. She tiptoed down the stairs, not knowing if she was alone or not. Still disoriented from the savage attacks earlier on, she found it hard to focus on her path. She headed towards the exit, her eyes constantly switching between the blood trail and the door in front of her. She couldn't take it anymore. Applejack closed her eyes and bolted for the exit. Her mind tried everything to memorize her path. She didn't want to open her eyes to see the evil Pegasus staring back at her. Those eyes, that laugh, and that horrendous smile. In no time, she was halfway up the stairs. She felt relieved to feel the fresh air brushing against her fur, drying her sweat-soaked mane. But then, thwang! She choked as she felt a rope wrap around her neck. The shock and impact of the force causing her to drop her pitchfork. Applejack was stuck, hanging in the air, desperately trying to wiggle herself free. But the rope was fastened too tightly. Just then, in the blink of an eye, she saw Rainbow Dash swinging from the cellar doors. The Pegasus kicked her in her chest, causing the rope to snap. The force threw Applejack back into the cold cellar, where she hit the ground with a loud thud. Her heart sank as she saw her only escape close before her. She began to cry hysterically before she heard a soul-shattering scream coming from behind her. She turned round to see Rainbow Dash in mid-flight, wielding a pitchfork in her hooves. Applejack rolled to her left, barely missing the sharp instrument as the Pegasus flew over her. As Applejack jumped onto her feet, Rainbow Dash threw the heavy tool towards her, but once again, Applejack was quick enough to dodge the weapon, causing it to stick into the wall behind her. Using what breath she had left to scream to the Pegasus, "Rainbow, stop!" She didn't stop. Instead, she slowly circled Applejack, watching her every step. Just as Applejack was able to finally get her breath back, the crazed mare lunged for her. Applejack locked hooves with Rainbow Dash, trying desperately to push her away. Despite Applejack being a prized rodeo pony, she couldn't possibly match the crazed Pegasus' strength. Applejack used all her might, her muscles burning under the strain, and yet it wasn't enough. Rainbow Dash was snapping her jaws, drool pouring from her mouth like a rabid dog. The horrific sight would be something that the poor Earth Pony would never forget. Applejack used the last of her strength to lean back and once again throw Rainbow Dash over her. She wasted no time in running for the exit. Her legs were on the verge of collapse just as she threw herself towards freedom. But fate had decided to be cruel to her on that day, as, just seconds from freedom, she was bucked by the Pegasus. The force threw the Earth Pony to the ground, across the cellar, past her tools and into the dull handle of the pitchfork sticking out of the wall. A painful crunch resounded across the room as the blunt instrument tore through her flesh, muscles, and her bones. Applejack couldn't breathe, and there was a warm, flooding feeling spreading through her chest. She looked down to see the blunt handle of the pitchfork sticking out of her chest, completely covered in blood. She was pinned against the wall. She couldn't move, and she could feel her blood pouring out of her wound, onto her hooves, and finally onto the floor. She began to cry in pain as she looked in front of her to see Rainbow Dash walking towards her, grinning, laughing, and holding a large splinter from before. Why? Applejack croaked, coughing up blood with each syllable. The Pegasus didn't answer. She just started to sing as she advanced with the splinter on her hoof. She used her wings to match her friend's height, using her free hoof to hold Applejack by the neck. The Pegasus just stared at Applejack, watching her fear build as she brought the wooden blade back for the fatal blow. Hush now, quiet now, it's time to lay your sleepy head. Hush now, quiet now, it's time to go to bed. Drifting off to sleep, exciting day behind you. Drifting off to sleep, let the joy of dreamland find you. Hush now, quiet now, lay your sleepy head. Hush now, quiet now, it's time to go to bed. Another beautiful dawn shone over Ponyville, the horizon alight with a mixture of radiant colors. Birds chirped in the trees, the sky was clear, and, once again, the Cutie Mark Crusaders were on their ongoing quest to discover their special talents. The horror of Pinky's death still loomed over them, and so they thought it would be best to try and distract themselves. "What are we going to do today?" Apple Bloom said, with a sad tone clear in her voice. "We haven't tried fencing yet," Scootaloo said enthusiastically, trying to lift her friends out of their bad mood. "What's fencing?" Sweetie Belle asked. "I'm glad you asked." Before Scootaloo could finish, she was interrupted by Rainbow Dash, landing in front of them with a loud thud, rocking the ground beneath their hooves. The three fillies recoiled at the clearly unstable pony, who stood in front of them. "Hey guys," Rainbow Dash said through her clenched teeth. The Cutie Mark Crusaders were not used to seeing Rainbow Dash like this. Her mane was matted to her head with sweat, her hooves were clogged with mud, and her wings were bent out of shape and covered in bruises. Are you all right?" Scootaloo asked, her voice full of concern. "Oh, I'm fine," Rainbow Dash squeaked. "Just fine. In fact, I'm great. So, I want to show you guys a new trick." "Really?" Scootaloo said excitedly. Rainbow Dash began to circle the three fillies, not once breaking eye contact with them as she stared into their pupils. "What do you say? Want to see my sweet moves?" Sorry, Dash," Apple Bloom said quietly. "We're kind of busy today." This didn't seem to bother the Blue Pegasus, who stood in front of them. She turned around and slowly started to strut away. "Okay, your loss. I'm sure there are plenty of fillies who'd love to see it. It really is amazing." Rainbow Dash continued to walk away, but Scootaloo jumped in front of her, blocking the path. "Wait!" the orange filly shrieked. "I want to see it! Show me! Show me!" Rainbow Dash stretched a large, yet heartwarming smile across her face. "Just as planned," she thought to herself. She leaned towards and placed a hoof on Scootaloo's shoulder. "Cool. Follow me, kiddo. Prepare to be amazed." "Okay," she turned to face her friends. "Sorry, guys. I guess I'll go crusading with you later. Bye." The orange filly, bouncing behind Rainbow Dash, followed in her footsteps. The remaining two crusaders were left behind, concern written across their faces. "Did Rainbow look a little odd to you?" Sweetie Belle asked. "Yeah," Apple Bloom replied. "Come on. Let's go see if there's some pony who can help us find our cutie marks." The two fillies walked off into town, leaving Scootaloo with Rainbow Dash. Scootaloo was still prancing around in excitement at the thought of seeing her idol perform her latest daredevil stunt. "So, what's this new trick? Come on, tell me!" Rainbow turned with a menacing grin on her face. It's the next best thing since my sonic rain boom." "Cool! So, why are we going to the barn again?" "Just follow my lead, kid. You'll see why." Later that morning, they made it to the barn. Scootaloo noticed the broken lock on the barn door. As she entered the building, a pungent smell slivered up to her nostrils, causing her to feel dizzy and lightheaded. "Blech! What's that?" Scootaloo gagged. Smell like rotten apples. Come on, Appledash said with a giggle, nudging the little filly towards the barn. As Scootaloo walked into the dark building, Rainbow Dash used her back legs to jam the door shut. Scootaloo was now beginning to shake with nerves as Rainbow Dash made her way towards a large box. So, Scootaloo muttered, what? Be patient, Rainbow yelled, taking the filly by surprise. Sorry, kid. I need to focus. Rainbow Dash gave a quick glance around to make sure that Scootaloo could not fully see what she was doing, and then proceeded to pull a large wooden splinter out of the chest. The instrument was still covered in blood from the crime earlier that day. She felt the tip before running the sharpness along her tongue, grinning as it pierced the muscle. It wasn't as sharp as before, but it was more than capable of finishing the job. Twitch. Rainbow Dash blinked, staring at the wall in front of her with a blank look on her face. Twitch. The blue Pegasus began to shake. Scootaloo noticed this, but she wasn't sure if it was something to do with her new trick or not. Not wanting to upset her, she stayed quiet and sat down, waiting. Twitch. Rainbow Dash let out a menacing snarl before slowly turning to face Scootaloo. The little filly was stricken with horror as she saw the evil Pegasus in front of her, slowly caressing the blade. Scootaloo jumped to her feet and instantly backed away from the horrible sight in front of her mind in an array of confusion. Why was her idol acting so strangely? Why had her expression changed to one of utter insanity? Why was she coming at her with a lethal weapon? Twitch! Rainbow? Scootaloo whimpered in fear. What are you doing? She didn't answer, but instead just kept smiling, slowly closing the gap. Scootaloo was cornered and had nowhere to run. Her only hope was to fly away. She squinted her eyes before using all the strength she had to flap her wings as fast as she could. She managed to gain a little height, collapsing onto the ground, exhausted. Her undeveloped wings were just not strong enough to support the weight of her body for very long. She looked up, and to her horror, she saw that Rainbow Dash was right in front of her, splinter in hand. Before Scootaloo could react, she was forced onto her back and held down by unnaturally strong grips. The poor filly tried to squirm out of the intense grip, but Applejack straddled her chest, holding her down. The Pegasus's smile kept getting bigger and bigger, feeling the adrenaline rush she had experienced when she took Applejack's life. Scootaloo didn't dare to shout or scream. She was too frightened and emotionally hurt. Instead, she looked directly at the Pegasus, with tears streaming out of hers. I thought you was gonna show me a trick. Twitch. Rainbow Dash paused before leaning forward, her inches away from the filly. Scootaloo could feel the Pegasus's stare burning through her skin and into her very soul itself. I am. It's a magic trick. Scootaloo winced, praying that this was just a sick joke and not for real. She kept trying to worm her way out, but the strength of the athletic Pegasus was just too much for the poor filly to overcome. Twitch, 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 twitch. I'm going to make you disappear. Rainbow grasped the blade and threw her arm into the air. Scootaloo closed her eyes and screamed as loud as she could, praying that some pony would save her, and, if not, that there would at least be a quick death. Scootaloo opened her eyes to see the horrifying sight in front of her. The insane mare was still towering above her, grasping the bloody splinter, breathing heavily, her evil eyes fixated on the little filly. But something was wrong. She wasn't smiling. Rainbow Dash's eyes widened as she shed a tear. The arm holding the splinter was shaking from the shoulder to hoof, almost like an invisible force was holding it back. Rainbow Dash let out a small whimper before looking at her hand. Just then, the hoof holding the splinter thrust itself into Rainbow Dash's right eye. Words cannot begin to describe the volume of the excruciating shriek that bellowed out of where the Pegasus's mouth was. The scream filled the barn and carried itself away to the farmhouse, where it was heard by Big Macintosh, taking him by surprise. The stallion could tell instantly where it was coming from, and started to gallop towards the barn. Meanwhile, Rainbow Dash was still screaming louder than the wounded Ursa Major before she jumped off of Scootaloo. The little filly was scared for life as she saw the Pegasus lean against the wall, mustering all the will she had to rip the splinter out of her eye. The second scream was even louder than the first one. Scootaloo winced as the ungodly sound almost made her eardrums explode. By the time he heard the second scream, Big Macintosh was halfway to the barn, his concerns confirmed by the unearthly howl. "Rainbow!" Scootaloo screamed before stepping towards her. "No!" Rainbow Dash screamed, making the young filly freeze. "Stay away! Just stay away from me!" Rainbow Dash looked at the terrified filly and began beating herself over the head with her hooves in a vain attempt to prevent the demons from possessing her mind once again. "Get out! Get out of my head!" "Rainbow Dash," Scootaloo whimpered, barely able to believe what she was seeing. "I'm sorry," Rainbow Dash cried. "I'm so sorry." Ugh. "Run! Run! Get out of... Run!" The filly looked terrifiedly desperate for an exit. She saw that there was no way she could open the door, and her wings were just not strong enough to carry her out of the window. So she ran to the cellar, knowing it was the only other way out. As Rainbow Dash beat herself against the sturdy walls of the barn, Scootaloo wrenched the doors open, wasting no time in running into the dark cellar, darting for the last exit. She climbed the stairs and jumped for her freedom, the sun burning her eyes, as thwang! The little filly was thrown back by a force of the rigged rope which was tied either side from the cellar doors. As she sat up and shook her head, she noticed the pungent smell was stronger than ever. Scootaloo gagged as she looked to her right, only to see the most horrific thing she had seen in the last 2 minutes. She saw Applejack, pinned to the wall, with the handle of a pitchfork sticking out of her chest. The pony's, now gray, fur was caked in blood. Her eyes were glazed over, and the floor was solid with blood, coating the hay below the skewered mare. The sight was too much for the poor filly, who almost cracked completely from the trauma. She made her way to the exit again, this time ducking under the rope. She felt empty, as she had it slowly sink in that her idol, her mentor, was a cold-blooded killer. Scootaloo kept running until she saw the red stallion in the distance, sprinting towards her. "Scootaloo!" Big Macintosh yelled. Scootaloo finally felt safe as she held on to Big Macintosh with what little strength she had. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" No, it's Rainbow Dash," Scootaloo yelled. "She's gone insane. She Applejack!" Another ear-shattering scream was heard from the barn. Big Macintosh's heart skipped a beat as he realized who was screaming. You get yourself back to the library. Tell Twilight what's happened, and don't leave till we get back. I can't. You can't go in. Go! Scootaloo can't argue anymore. She closed her tearing up eyes and ran towards the library as Big Macintosh galloped towards the barn doors.